Elections are a messy business, just like democracy overall is unduly messy. That's why such thing as political operatives emerged on the market in order to at least create the illusion of an orderly business. This is particularly evident during campaign events, be they rallies, parties, concerts, or outreach efforts to raise signatures. Whether that task is achieved or not is a separate discussion, but what we do know is that over time, some basic ground rules did emerge, or better said, some entrenched practices. Now, does that make those practices inherently good or necessarily successful in a predictable manner? No, not really. If that had been the case, there would have never been a Donald Trump or a Coalition Avenir in Quebec. The existence of such successful models tells us something, namely that in addition to learning the style and tactics of the establishment, the non-left has to also come up with something different. Not necessarily better, but different. How different? Well, that's a bit complicated, but I'll take a stab at it. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Now, no matter when I do this video, it will always be interpreted, so I might as well do it now and mention that what I'm about to say is pretty timeless and does apply at least for the foreseeable future, which in political operative speak means at the most 5 years. So it's 2019 now, or the current year plus 4 after Trudeau. I'll revise this again in 2023 or 2024. So, for the purposes of this talk, the presentation is divided as follows. Number 1, what is and what isn't a campaign event from a propaganda perspective. 2, how to promote it. 3, organizing in a friendly area. 4, organizing in enemy territory. 5, what to do in case of trouble. 6, realistic expectations, or what to expect in order to avoid disappointment and maximize the return of investment. And number 7, conclusions. So, with that said, let us begin. Number 1. What is and what isn't a campaign event from a propaganda perspective? I insist with the qualifier from a propaganda perspective because as a political operative, I'm not interested in the legal aspect. Any semi-decent campaign has a lawyer somewhere around, so have the lawyer figure out the legalese business. So here's the first lesson. Divide your labor fairly. Do not think you know everything about everything, and under no circumstance should you leave the whole business on just one person. Therefore, a campaign event is one that you have previously marketed as organized by your party or organization. That's it. Everything else is not a campaign event from a propaganda perspective. It sounds easy, but it isn't because way too many on the non-left have moral qualms when it comes to engaging in propaganda. The left doesn't have this problem. That's why the left rarely wins in rural areas and routinely wins in urban areas. And that's why the non-left must learn this in order to make gains in urban areas. So, as a result of this piece of wisdom, you should always strive to avoid organizing a campaign event from a propaganda perspective in an urban area. That is to say, avoid for as long as possible to associate your campaign or your political party with an event in official propaganda. Translation: subvert whatever you can. For instance, a March for Life is not a campaign event. But if you are a non-leftist party, you better be there and make friends with the organizers and make sure you have a roll-up with your own party somewhere in the event. If it's election season, make sure your shills are out there too. If possible, your candidate should be there as well. If anyone asks, you're just a participant, just like everyone else. The same goes for any festival that takes place in the targeted community. For instance, a Lady Gaga concert is, for all intents and purposes, an event of the far left. But from a propaganda perspective, it's not. a campaign event. This distinction is important because if anything goes wrong, not only you don't have to, but you should not rush to defend or spin anything. The responsibility, in propaganda terms, does not lie with you. As such, you can afford a lot more leeway than during an event that is explicitly yours. That's why Lady Gaga can afford to say what an official leftist candidate usually can't. And the non-left should do the same. Promote or bring artists that are sympathetic to your ideas, and then organize events that go out of their way to avoid association with your party, while at the same time shill for most or all of the ideas of your party. And you may say that's hard, but it really isn't. I mean, few people realize that one of the reasons you don't see many more openly conservative artists is not because they don't exist, it's because the non-left refuses to claim them. For instance, Britney Spears is a staunch social conservative and a capitalist. Has anyone ever invited her to shill for that? No, of course not, because non-leftists are a bunch of pussies. So, to sum up this point, if you haven't explicitly marketed an event as being organized by your political party, then that event is not a campaign event for propaganda purposes. That means almost anything goes, and the limiting principle is the negotiation between you and the official organizer. I dwell a lot on this point because you absolutely should strive to organize as many events like these as possible, and definitely more of these events than official propaganda and campaign events. And the reason is simple. Politics is downstream from culture, and this cannot be stressed enough in the current climate where voter apathy is the norm, which means it is once again the cycle in history where you first entice potential voters with ideas associated with things they already like, and then you come up with the party platform. You're all smart peeps, you get the point. Number 2, how to promote it. So, with the distinction understood between what constitutes a campaign event and what doesn't, now you want an event that is a campaign event in the distinction mentioned earlier, and you want to promote it. Now, most of the legwork is identical to promoting any other kind of product. Not a huge difference in organizational and publicity terms between an outreach event organized by a corporation launching a new product and what a political campaign has to do, which is why you should retain, if you can afford, the services of a marketer and a copywriter. What you should be looking out for as a political operative are two things: meme potential and shilling organizing. These two are your job, not the marketer's job. So now let's look at each of them. Meme potential means exactly what it says. Evaluate what is the meme, the potential in meme creation as a result of what the marketing department produced. Let me give you an example. The incumbent president of Romania is running for re-election at the moment of this recording, and his campaign first revealed message can be abbreviated as PORN, as you can see on the screen. Now, he stands a great chance of being re-elected, so the assumption is that he can afford the mockery or having his campaign slogan memed into oblivion, but your candidate may not afford that. So be vigilant on mistakes like these, which can result in memes. And not just for negative connotation, but also for positive connotation as well. If you find something is memeable, do it yourself and distribute it to your shills. Which brings me to the second issue, shilling organizing. Now, promoting your event is not just paid ads on social media or newspaper and whatever, putting up posters and all the rest. Promoting your event also means shills. After all, you want as many people as possible who are inclined to or persuadable to vote for your candidate to attend the event. As a non-leftist, many of those people may reside in the blob that rarely votes or has rarely been voting lately. As a result, they may not see or notice your official posters. Hence, you need the shills and an organized shilling campaign. A shill doesn't have to be paid necessarily, or indeed doesn't even have to know he or she is a shill. Even so, in my experience, professional shills are usually the least effective. Gone are the days when the public would trust professional shills. So, as a result, you need to get creative. For instance, I routinely try to recruit bartenders as shills. Believe it or not, many bartenders are pretty open to non-leftist ideas, even in deeply leftist areas. If you remember, last year I took a short trip to Ontario, Canada, and like always, I tried to shill for new ideas. The only locals with whom I had some success were the bartenders. The least success I had was with the cab drivers, which makes sense. Cab drivers are a protected class in most localities, whereas bartenders and servers in general are really not. Bar staff has the advantage of not being seen as a particularly political demographic, not yet anyway, that still routinely gets into random conversations with the general public. And to me, that is untapped potential. I mean, it is preferable for servers to discuss the next political event in town rather than the result of the last game. I mean, I'm just saying. Then you should also recruit shills where the opposition expects the least. So for instance, if you're in an area with a lot of government employees, recruit a shill from those institutions. The shill doesn't have to openly support your campaign. It's enough if the shill promotes a message along the lines of, well, we should attend. I mean, why not? At least we get informed about some of their ideas, or words to that effect. I'll get back to this when I get to organizing in enemy territory. I hope I won't forget. Another place where you can recruit shills is factory workers or blue-collar workers in general. In my experience, it's best to start with those that are not known to their colleagues as non-leftists. Those make the best shills. And one way to approach them is to use dissatisfaction with the local union, because nobody, except for the union bosses, is really content or satisfied with their union. If you try hard enough in this department, eventually you will not only find people to shill for your campaign events, but people willing to shill for your ideas and your candidates in the future as well. So be nice to people when canvassing amongst blue-collar workers. Another place where you can recruit shills from is high schools. Now, this is legally tricky, but generally high schoolers can safely be approached when they're out of school. If you can approach them in school, then stop wasting your time watching this video and make the phone call and set up the first meeting. Pause this video and make the phone call. I'm serious, do it now. I mean, non-leftists are, how should I put this, squishy when it comes to approaching teenagers. The left has no moral qualms in using teenagers for their political games, but the non-left keeps on insisting on playing by rules that were never a thing, really. Anyway, this is really a separate video on just how frustrating it is to work with non-leftists who refuse to engage in the game that is actually being played. Anyway, so once you recruited your shills, then your job during the phase of promoting your event is to organize them. Random, mostly uncoordinating shilling only works if it's massive, like it was in 2016 for Donald Trump. More likely than not, if you're watching this, you're looking at a much smaller campaign, which means you got work to do. A common mistake by many political operatives is to try to avoid double targeting when organizing shilling. That is to say, they try to shill their business, in this case the campaign event, to as many people as possible. This is wrong. Or maybe I should say, this is ineffective, because if the candidate is well known, then shilling to as many people as possible is a waste of time, since most people know him or her already, and should instead rally the core base to make the event successful. If the candidate is new or is running for a new political party, then shilling to as many people as possible is a waste of time, because your candidate will become part of the background noise for the voters. What you should do instead is to have a list of people, let's say 3,000, that are more likely than not to attend your event. Then make sure those people hear from your shills at least twice, preferably 4 or 5 times, from different shills in different circumstances. This is the most important aspect. If the same shill bothers a person twice or thrice, then that's nagging and you're pissing off that person. If 3 different shills bother that same person in 3 different days, in 3 different circumstances, then that's more likely to result in a positive answer because it creates the illusion that the candidate is actually a lot more popular than he, the voter, previously thought. And there must be something going on if so many people in so many circumstances are mentioning his event or his events. So yeah, this is basic astroturfing. It's how Obama rose from nobody to president in under 18 months, by having a very well organized shilling team. So yeah, that's basically your job as far as promoting the event is concerned. Watch out for the meme potential. Recruit and organize the shills, and everything else is just like any other commercial or charitable event. Posters, banners, that's the easy part. Now, onto the event itself. Number 3, organizing in a friendly area. Now, keep in mind that this is the perspective of the political operative. That not only means it is not your concern to do budgeting or to arrange chairs, though of course you can do that too if you're short on staff. It's just that it's not and shouldn't be your priority. But it also means you need a logistics man. And yes, it has to be a man. The political operative can be a woman too, but the logistics guy has to be a guy. Preferably a working class guy who gives no shit. Why? Because you need someone to enforce reality. I have such a man almost all the time with me when I conduct in the open activities. Almost always the same man. He's always there to tell me what is logistically possible and what isn't. What are the options, and also act as the liaison between the political concerns brought up by me and the rest of the concerns brought up by third parties. Now, the third parties are owners of venues and owners of equipment in case we rent the equipment and the political party doesn't have its own, caterers, and so on and so forth. Now, when you're in friendly territory as a political operative, you have 3 things you need to accomplish. Number 1, make sure you don't piss off anyone, and if you have to, then make sure it's contained. 2, always be on the lookout on how to attract more people in the same territory, that is to say, to make an area more conservative than it already is. And 3, during the event, try to test some new ideas. So, a bit on each of these. Making sure you don't piss off anyone basically means play safe. So, for instance, if you have to choose between 2 venues of roughly similar performances, choose the one owned by someone closer to you or the party you're playing for, even if it's more expensive. If the caterer happens to be a big fan and asks to have a selfie with your candidate, grant that without hesitation, even if it might be a security risk. It's better to work a bit harder than to disappoint or piss off your hardcore fans. If you rented equipment from a local company that is run by a friend of the political party, then make sure any problems are solved via gentlemen's agreements and not via lawyers or a court of law. I mean, I won with a weak candidate once because the opponent didn't pay attention to this detail and he sued the studio for something that it was actually his fault. When my campaign caught wind of that, we shredded them in propaganda framing, because we framed the issue that the opposition can't even manage a few $100 without getting buried in court documents. So how could they be trusted to run the city hall with a budget of billions? So yeah, make sure you don't do that. If problems emerge, take the path of least trouble and don't rock the boat if you are in friendly territory. Always being on the lookout on how to attract more people in the same territory means that you go out of your way to make sure at least 10% of the attendees are people who don't regularly attend political events. Again, preferably high schoolers or folks no older than 23. Why? Because people introduced to politics to a party at 16 or 17 tend to stay with that party a lot longer than those who come to politics at 30. You may think it's cheesy, but politics is about votes, and an 18-year-old molded by his or her community into a certain set of values and then introduced to the political expression of those values early on is likely to stay that way in terms of voting, even if later on in life one will nuance some of his positions. And finally, trying out new ideas is pretty self-evident. You're in friendly territory with largely your base. This is the ideal territory where you can tout new ideas and gauge what the base is feeling about that. Call it internal priming, if you want. Oh, goddammit. Now I realize that I haven't made a video about priming yet. Okay, basically, when looking into the political future, and particularly the propaganda approach of the political future of your candidate or side, the first thing you do is decide on the framing, which is a complex process that I will not discuss in public anytime soon because it really needs concrete examples and it would take me several hours to explain. Now, once you know the framing, then you test narratives and see what sticks. That is priming. Once you know these, then you proceed to seeding. I will explain these steps in a separate video. But yeah, priming is both for the general public and for the inside of your party. And when you are in a friendly area, you should not be shy to try this out. Not only you learn more about your potential voters, but you also might learn something from the voters. It's a win-win all round, which is why you should do it. Now, on to the harder part, number 4, organizing in enemy territory. Now, quite frankly, an entire book could be written about this because there are so many jurisdictions, each with its own specifics, and that makes it very hard to come up with generalities or general approaches. Nevertheless, there are a few things that are pretty much the same, chief among them being that organizing in enemy territory makes your day as a political operative a freaking nightmare because you have a lot of work to do. For starters, make sure you have a very good lawyer. Why? Because you might see your venue cancelled at a moment's notice, or at least attempted to, which is why you need a lawyer to use as leverage against the venue that is cucking to the mob. You might still end up in trouble, but at least you get your shekels back and some reparations. Secondly, always you as the political operative go alongside the candidate and the lawyer when negotiating every contract every step of the way. Make sure the contract explicitly stipulates the harshest punishments for the venue you can get away with in case of the event being cancelled as a result of left-wing mob. Thirdly, always be recording. I don't care what the law says in your jurisdiction. You, as the political operative, record everything. Every negotiation, every tip, and every interaction with anyone not a member of your campaign's inner circle. In my experience, about half of the times you will end up recording something that might be useful from a propaganda perspective later on in the campaign or in future campaigns. So, buy equipment for this and record everything. Fourthly, keep tabs on the usual suspects that might want to try to disrupt your event. If you notice anything suspicious, notify the head of security. If such thing doesn't exist, I mean small campaigns don't have a head of security, then compile a dossier and send it to the police and get that on official record. If your suspicions don't pan out, nothing happens. But if your suspicions turn out to be correct, then you have a multitude of approaches. If the police does its job, then you praise them and have your candidate present them as a model of law enforcement that other police departments should learn from. If the police does a half-baked job, you still praise them in a more moderate tone and then propose solutions on how to improve policing. And of course, you condemn in no uncertain terms the violence while your minions make sure they gather as much intelligence as possible about the aggressors. Yes, you should have an intelligence department in the campaign. If the police does nothing, even though you warn them, then you scold them a bit and then have your candidate promise that if elected, he will make policing great again by increasing the funding and by encouraging the hiring of new police officers who understand these new challenges. And that is just the beginning. Then you have to make what's it called, a snap judgment on the tone of the messaging during the event. Now, that's not something you can easily predict weeks before the event. It's a decision you'll have to make 2 days before the event, and at best, sometimes you have to make that decision in the morning of that day. Basically, it all comes down on how you're feeling the community that day versus the overall aims of the party or the candidate you are playing for. For instance, if you're Trump in California, it doesn't really matter. Just being there is triggering enough, so as a political operative, you don't have to do anything really rather than promote the event. But if you're Alternative für Deutschland in a social democrat area, then you got work to do. In such a scenario, as an operative for AfD, I would emphasize the messaging that sounds the closest to a social democrat discourse, then hit hard home the point that you can't have a welfare state with open borders. That's weak from a conservative standpoint, but it's quite effective in terms of breaking voters away from social democrats. Now, if the area has a lot of SJWs, for instance, you may want to poke fun at them as well. But again, it really does depend on the particularities of the community. For instance, in Berlin, poking fun at SJWs brings you some attention from the Lügenpresse, but it doesn't seem to cost that many votes. But the same logic doesn't necessarily apply everywhere. For instance, in Canada, voters are clearly fed up with Trudeau, but not because he's an SJW, but because he turned out to be exactly what conservatives predicted, an utterly incompetent buffoon. Political operatives in this case should make the case that Trudeau's SJW leanings was part of the problem and try to tie Trudeau's far leftism on cultural issues with his other failings. Now, is that an easy thing to do? No, I don't think it is easy. My trip to Ontario left me with a very bad taste about the state of mind of the voters. But hey, let's hope I'm wrong. It's not often, but I've been wrong in the past too. Now, after you made the snap judgment, then you also have to be alert during the event at all time, and if you have a security team, be in coordination with them all of the time in case you need to eject troublemakers. And here's another snap judgment you need to make. Some troublemakers can be propagandistically useful. Others, not so much. So if you spot a troublemaker, it is on you, the political operative, to make the snap call on whether to let him or her stick around and cause some trouble to be then used for viral videos and further propaganda, or to eject the individual before he or she makes oneself noticed. I'll get a bit more into that in a minute. Meanwhile, after the event, you also need to have a few of your people infiltrated into the crowds to gauge the effect of the event on the people's mood and opinions. This is standard operating procedure because regardless of what the goals and or expectations are, getting as much unfiltered feedback as possible is very important so you'll get an idea about what works and what doesn't. The reason I recommend having a few people infiltrated there is because in hostile territory, there is a very high chance that if you ask them officially, attendees may not be honest. In fact, this is exactly what happened at many Democrat events during the 2016 presidential campaign in the US. Democrat operatives tried to gauge the mood by doing what they've always done: go to the attendees as Democrat operatives, upfront about it, and ask questions. The result? Undecided Democrats gave them the usual script, and then most of them ended up voting for Donald Trump. But the operatives had no way of knowing that until after the election. Meanwhile, Republicans did exactly what I just suggested earlier. That's why Trump rallies in the Rust Belt kept on getting better over time. Not because he was necessarily more empathetic, though that might be a factor too, I just don't think so, but because the operatives were much better at identifying hostile territory and thus deployed appropriate actions to assess the mood and collect unfiltered feedback. Then there are the subtle cues. While this video is strictly about organizing and not about the content of the event, which I'll cover in another video some other time, the subtle cues are also part of organizing, and you, as the political operative, should have a say in that. For instance, if you're a non-left party, make sure you have meat in everything food related. If you feel compassionate for the fools, you may have a vegetarian option, but make it as hard as possible to access it. When I put out events, I make sure the only thing vegetarian available is bread. That's a not so subtle cue right there. Also, when picking the venue, make sure to pick one that doesn't have a single restroom, but proper sex-segregated restrooms. Most people don't care about that, but potential troublemakers will. And if someone whines, it's a good opportunity to exploit that for propaganda. Hey, I didn't make the rules. In fact, I begged the left not to politicize everything because it will bite them in the ass. But they didn't listen, so I guess now it's time for payback. Also, in this subtle cues department, make sure your candidate uses only traditional language. In other words, your candidate should not find himself or herself speaking like a posh intellectual, but rather to speak like normal people do. Bush, Trump, and even Barack Obama did not win elections by speaking like they're at Harvard Law or Cornell. I mean, I'm just saying. And Hillary lost because she spoke like that. Now, whatever you choose to use in the subtle cues department, make sure you don't emphasize it either. That's why it's called subtle. And the reason is pretty simple. To promote something as normal, it has to be normal during your event. So no shameless promoting of any kind, please. Then there is a more controversial suggestion that I always try it when I'm asked for an opinion on an event, namely to block Wi-Fi of any kind in the building. Emergency calls are one thing, but do you really want your attendees to spend time on their phones on Facebook? I don't, which is why I insist on limiting internet connectivity during events of interest. But this is not the only reason. The other reason is to gain additional control of the narrative. It's a whole lot better when you control the live broadcasting. Troublemakers are going to do what they're going to do anyway, and you can't stop that. But you can exert a bit of control over the narrative of their troublemaking before they can do that. Because they can't broadcast in real time if the Wi-Fi is off. But you can. As I said, this is a controversial suggestion, and I don't blame you for not considering it. But I am saying that whenever it was tried at events organized in enemy territory, it yielded great results. And finally, one more thing, surveillance. And when I say surveillance, I really mean NSA style if possible. Nothing should be happening at your event without you or someone else in the campaign to be informed, preferably in real time. This, of course, depends on the number of people and the amount of money and equipment you have available, but ideally a combination between people keeping an eye on things and video cameras and microphones is great. Why? Because if anything goes wrong, you can easily produce exculpatory evidence either for propaganda purposes in cases of serious trouble for the police. I mean, you don't even have to keep the material for too long. After the election, feel free to purge everything. But it's quite important to have it until then, because you'd be surprised how many secrets and strategies the opposition will openly speak about, even while they're supposedly incognito at your event. I'm just saying, experience is pretty clear on this. Alright, now on to the crisis. Number 5, what to do in case of trouble. Now, trouble can mean a lot of things, from some minor friction to outright violent crime. Established wisdom usually recommends simply evicting any troublemaker on the spot and surrender that person to the police, since it is now pretty much the norm to have a police presence at these kinds of campaign events. Now, that's not entirely wrong, and I would never blame anyone for going that route. The problem is that that route may be a bit too extreme in many communities or simply unenforceable. It also means missing out on propaganda opportunities. Ideally, you should make a quick assessment before calling in the cavalry. A troublemaker can indeed do much more good than bad. In fact, imagine having a big red disrupting your event. Or that woman who was screaming to the sky during Trump's inauguration. These kinds of troublemakers are a huge net positive if their troublemaking is thoroughly caught on tape. That's why I mentioned the thorough surveillance earlier, by the way. The same goes when assessing violence. Please don't use the pussified standard. A bit of pushing may be technically violence, but is it really? Because you might get more propaganda value out of a troublemaker on tape pushing someone around than out of immediately calling the police to slam that person to the ground. Yes, that's a cynical analysis, but I didn't say you should create your own troublemaker. In fact, it is unwise to put one of your own to do the troublemaking because the likelihood of achieving perfect execution of such a task is zero. Something always goes bad. Even if you don't get caught and everyone swallows the narrative, it may still mean your actor take a trip to the police and be known in the community as a troublemaker without any significant gain for such a price paid. Also, rehabilitating that individual and using him or her later on is very difficult, so don't orchestrate attacks against yourselves. It's just bad practice. The return of investment, even in best case scenarios when you try to orchestrate attacks against yourself, is terrible. However, if a troublemaker appears, you absolutely should think the situation from a propaganda perspective. And not just in assessing whether to evict the troublemaker or not, but also in what to do after you've made up your mind. How you remove the troublemaker can be propagandistically useful too. So if you're playing a law and order type of campaign, it is preferable for the removal to be very aggressive, caught on tape, and then memed, and have your candidate prepare a line in case such events occur. If you decide to keep the troublemaker, do your best not to challenge him or her. Let the individual go apeshit and get the sweet footage of normal people just looking at the individual with disdain. That is a very powerful message. Basically, what I'm saying is that you shouldn't leave anything to chance and be prepared to score a propaganda win out of as many situations as possible. Now, of course, there can be, and there will be, if you do this long enough, situations that will catch you off guard. And that's okay. Nobody can plan for everything. But you absolutely should be prepared for the most common ones. For instance, in Canada, it is common to have a few students, usually no more than 5, infiltrate and then stand up and chant some crappy slogan. Such situations should not catch you unprepared. Have 1 or 2 lines that your candidate can use to respond. Let the situation roll for no more than 5 minutes tops, and then have the students removed as aggressively as possible. Then have your candidate say, "Welcome to parliamentarian politics, chaps. 5 minutes is the maximum allotted time for a speaker. Thank you for your speech," and then continue on as if nothing happened. Heckler's veto is pretty common in many countries, so be prepared to stomp it without hesitation. Also, if the hecklers call you a fascist, use that as a great opportunity to explain to the whole public a bit of Olavo de Carvalho wisdom about how your mother is a fascist.
Eu respondi, fascista é sua mãe.
I-am răspuns, fascista e măta.
One other aspect that you should keep in mind is that most people are not ideological. Not in the way political operatives are or they're supposed to act. That means you don't waste your time to refute the hecklers on their terms, because almost none of the attendees will understand that anyway, and they don't have to. That's why I'm suggesting one-liners meant to mock or shame the troublemakers, because those are much easier to understand and because your job is to make the case to a non-ideological audience that the left is insane. Having a leftist troublemaker present does 80% of the job for you. So take it home and do the rest of the 20% by refraining from spurging out, or even worse, trying to reason with the loons. No, just don't do that. Now, of course, the whole game changes if the heckler is a competing politician, but lately the politicians have become quite insulated, so it's very rare to see a politician going to the opposition's events. It's usually some low-key lackey that they send to do their bidding. Speaking of which, your candidate should try to go to the left's events and document everything going on there. Anyway, you get the point. All throughout the event, think about as many ways as possible in which you can make this a positive spin for your team. Don't be nervous about it. Everyone else is doing exactly the same thing. Now, on to expectations. Number 6. This is the part where the political operative has to explain to those who don't understand these things that no, just because you made an event, it doesn't mean you grow or decrease in the polls next day. That's not how this works. Rarely it is the case for a candidate to see significant changes, positive or negative, in his or her polling data after just one event. I mean, yeah, sure, Hillary saw some significant changes after her basket of deplorables comment, which, by the way, was delivered in the friendly territory at some LGBT organization, but that was a serious fuck-up on her part, and the next day she doubled down on it. Now that was a spectacular own goal. So yeah, this is one expectation. Do not fuck up that badly while on friendly territory. It's tempting for all politicians to go a bit overboard with their enthusiasm when they're speaking to a friendly audience. We saw the same thing with Mitt Romney with his 47% comment back in 2012, which led to Obama getting re-elected. And just like Hillary, Romney thought nobody unfriendly will hear it and take issue with it. The way to avoid these kinds of fuck-ups is to rely on shills, political operatives, and policy makers. I can afford to say that the left should be helicoptered, but there's no way I would ever advise a political candidate to say that on the stage. Ever. Even if it's an allegedly closed-circuit event, you just don't do that. The candidate is there to deliver the party platform. Agitation and propaganda, including propaganda via highly edgy jokes, are not the job of the candidate. And when I say this, some will say, oh, but what about Trump? Yeah, what about Trump? Even Trump avoids really edgy stuff. He has his son to deliver those, and a huge army of political operatives. Those people deliver the edgy stuff. Trump avoids them, and that's smart. I mean, look closely at Donald Trump's rallies. He lets the audience to utter the more radical stuff while he steps away from the microphone. That's how you do it. So yeah, don't expect significant changes in polling data after one event. Do those kinds of evaluations maybe after at least 3 events. That's about right for you to start do such evaluations. Don't expect to enjoy these events. This is another nugget of wisdom. These events exist for the information and the entertainment of potential voters. For candidates and political operatives alike, these events are a nightmare. I'll be honest with you, campaigning is really, really hard work, with little to no short-term gain. Also, don't expect everything to run smoothly. Even the highly professional, very well-funded campaign events still do have their minor fuck-ups. So be ready to have to scream at somebody to do their bloody job. Generally, just make sure the essentials are kosher. Everything else will sort of fall into place, and what doesn't can be corrected as you go. Perfect is the enemy of good. So don't aim for perfection, because you ain't gonna make it. Also, be prepared to run an event with a lot fewer participants than you previously expected. This is true especially for those of you running small campaigns, like for the town hall or a smaller congressional or parliamentarian district. Single digits or even 0 participants are a thing, especially if you run from a newly created party or in a particularly apathetic community. Now, if that happens, be prepared to run the event anyway, videotape everything, and then distribute the video. Take advantage of the opportunity to shape the narrative in the best possible way. Again, don't be shy. You're neither the first nor the last to have to run an event with a low number of participants. I mean, it happened to others too. Hillary spent billions and ran at least 20 events with less than 30 people in the auditorium. Trump had events with 100 people too. And he's the freaking president with like 52% approval rate. So if it can happen to these kinds of candidates, don't be too surprised if it happens to your candidate from time to time. Now, of course, if it happens 3 times in a row, it's obviously a problem on your end. I'm not saying ignore the signals, but what I am saying is that you should be a bit realistic about things. I once met a political operative who was campaigning for the opponent of my candidate. He was planning out a campaign event for like 3,000 people at 5 p.m. in a town where his candidate was polling best with the manual labor class, which was at work at that hour. And one could at best rely on 10,000 votes in total. Of course, I didn't say anything, I just went to my candidate and asked for the funds to put out an event for 500 people at 8 p.m. with shilling in the working class. We got a 2,000 attendance. The opponent ran the event only with party members, about 50 people. I mean, that was a fine day. My candidate won, by the way, in a town where the left had never lost since 1933. Now, I admit, we got lucky a little bit, but then again, as they say, fortune favors the bold. I'm telling you these things essentially to set you up for modest expectations, because if you start with modest expectations, the chances of you exceeding them are pretty high, which means strong morale going forward. Team morale is very important in a campaign. If your team, including your candidate, doesn't believe he or she can win, then your involvement into the process will be suboptimal, which usually leads to losing. One more thing you shouldn't expect: nice weather. If you're having the event outdoors, that is, don't expect nice weather. Be prepared for terrible weather. It's really quite comical how often it happens to get some rain just when an outdoor political event is due to start. I'm not saying it happens every single time, but in my experience, and I do attend outdoor political events very often, it's almost as if it's a Murphy's Law. You can predict the rain by whether an outdoor political event is happening in town or not. All right, now, on to number 7, conclusions. Now, this presentation is the shortest summary of my experience, as well as the experience of people close to me in similar roles. I focused in this video exclusively on the organizing from the perspective of the political operative, or propaganda officer, or political strategist, or whatever the fancy term is these days for the individual that is responsible for the overt, covert, and subtle communication. I didn't say anything about the content of the event. That will be a story for another day, when I'll explain what priming, seeding, and active measures are, and a bit on how to do that. Priming and seeding are essential knowledge for a political operative because more often than not, this is what the content of a campaign has to be in the early stages. Though, of course, as you grow, seeding is less relevant. I will tell this story some other day. Unlikely this month, though, because, well, it's only a few days left, but surely in October, I hope. So yeah, the main takeaway from this is that organizing a successful campaign event is as much of an art as it is a science. Now, I would venture to say that it is about 50% science, 40% art, and 10% luck or fortune. Get the science right, and at least you stand a chance. But the art of it is a really long learning process. Heck, I don't consider myself to be a great master of this art. I'm semi-decent at best, but that's because I suck at arts in general. It's true. Another aspect to keep in mind is the fact that the internet matters a lot less than way too many people still assume it does. This is especially true in parliamentary elections, where you're campaigning in a limited constituency, or in local elections. So treat the internet as a secondary asset, and with the money saved on useless sponsored posts, use that for more boots on the ground. Right now, in my hometown, the left is preparing a great online game in order to attempt to defeat the incumbent, who has been the mayor since 2012 and also 4 more years in the previous decade, and almost always re-elected by over 60% of the votes. And they will likely lose again if the incumbent decides to run again, because the left assumes that everyone that is on the internet is also a voter. But that's far from true. And this aspect is crucial in local elections, including constituencies for the parliament. You may get a very good online game, but even if you attract genuine fans, there is no guarantee that those people can legally vote in the race you're running in. That's why the online side has to be complementary rather than the main focus, to save time, or to better say, to use the time more efficiently. On the internet, you don't know who is an eligible voter and who isn't, so you might end up wasting time to convince someone who can't vote. If you're in a big constituency, let's say 3 million voters or more, your online game should be focused on wasting the time of the opposition. It works wonders, really. Okay, one final conclusion when it comes to this topic is that you really need to know the community very well. If you, as the political operative, are not from the community, then make sure you surround yourself by people who are from there and develop a peer review process for your propaganda. Everything I said in this very long video assumes that the political operative either knows that community really well or has access to such people to use as filters. If you don't get this aspect right, you do run the risk of being tone deaf and eventually fail. It's what happened to Hillary. She relied on 10 to 20 political operatives who weren't bad at their job, but they just could not have possibly known all of the communities. And instead of getting some input in that direction, they doubled down on the Central Committee's message. And that was terrible. So that's really all I have to say about this from the operative side. Now, keep in mind that the political operative is not the same person as the campaign manager. The campaign manager is basically a logistical position, the hands and the feet of the operation. The operative is the brain of the operation. So, what do you all think? If you have been involved in any sort of political events in any position, do drop me a line, either in the comments or even better by email with your experience. I'm sure I can learn from you and you can learn some more from me. The point is that these kinds of conversations have to happen a lot more often in the next few years, because the new generations, by virtue of biology, will take over from the older ones, and if we know what we're doing, we might get to change things a lot faster. Yes, politics is downstream from culture, but while some are more suited to fight the culture war, as they should, the struggle in that department must continue unabated, others might be more suited for this kind of day-to-day politics. It doesn't bring you any titles, bylines, or celebrity status, but it does put you in a position to quite literally change the politics of your region or country. Hopefully for the better and away from the left. So, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. Please do consider a donation should you derive any value from the work being done here. Subscribe to our social media, visit our website, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.